Good morning, Team Krulak community, and welcome back to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine war. Still here with you, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center, and as always, we're joined by Dr. Yuval Weber, our resident Russia subject matter expert. And today, as Yuval mentioned here a little while before we started, this is going to be a momentous episode, and for a number of reasons. Partly momentous in the sense in that we're marking some milestones today. Specifically, today is got significance of its own. Today is it's the 31st Independence Day of Ukraine, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Today also marks exactly 6 months since the invasion began, since Russian troops first crossed the Ukrainian border and tried their decapitation effort to take over Ukraine sort of on the cheap, with shock and awe and assuming that the people would be on their side, which 6 months later, obviously that didn't happen. And we're in a very different type of war right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to look back over the last 6 months and look at the different phases of the war. You've also got some kind of a framework we're going to follow here. And then before we leave, we do want to make sure we catch you up to date on sort of more recent developments, especially in the last 72 to 96 hours, because there's been some weird stuff going on in Russia of late for anyone who's been watching the news. So let's just get right to it. So Yuval, welcome back. And all right, 6 months into the war, what are sort of some of the big themes we're looking at right now?
So great. It's when we started these, we were hoping that this would not be a long-running series of indefinite duration, and it's very unfortunate that we are where we are. So where I wanted to start is really to think about, we're 6 months in. We've now seen that there have been, in a sense, 3 phases of this conflict and 2 big questions. And we even had, when we're started recording, it is Wednesday morning, around 9 a.m. And we just had some big news, hit the waves about an hour ago, which we'll get to in a second. So the first wave, the first phase of this conflict was basically Russia's 3-day war. They wanted to do the shock and awe across the entire country. And as their POWs gave interviews at the outset of the war, once they got very surprisingly captured by unexpectedly fierce resistance, is that the Russian war plan at the very beginning had been to capture Kyiv in roughly 3 days. And in effect, the Russian theory of victory at the very outset of the war reflected what President Putin, Vladimir Putin, had been talking about for months beforehand, which is that, in effect, Russia and Putin was directly projecting his views of Russia onto Ukraine, in which the people of Ukraine were not going to fight for Zelensky, the individual. And Russian state media ahead of that time took a lot of energy, a lot of time to denigrate President Volodymyr Zelensky personally, calling him a drug addict, Nazi, all these sort of very bad things. The idea being people of Ukraine aren't going to fight for Zelensky personally. And so that when the Russian forces came into Kyiv, there might be token resistance of, these Saddam-style dead-enders around Parliament building, around the presidential office, and so forth. After 3 days of that, Kyiv would fall, and basically Russia would spend the next 2 weeks collecting surrenders from across the rest of the country. And that what Russia would get in its initial theory of victory is basically a brand new government, regime change on the cheap, very quick, almost bloodless, new government in Kyiv, which would then come to its quote-unquote senses, mainly because, as we found out over the last couple of months, Russia's idea of the people that would lead a post-Zelensky Ukraine would be Yanukovych, the guy who was chased out in 2014, or Medvedchuk, basically Putin's personal friend, who had long been playing a role in Ukrainian politics. So that's what Russia was expecting, reinstalling Ukraine as a client state from the get-go. Thereafter, since that didn't work out, and this was at the time where we saw that Russian logistics simply were not in place for an actual fight. We then had Russia reset into phase 2 of its conflict. And phase 2 of its conflict was they're not trying to conquer the whole country. They're not trying to conquer all the territory that's east of the Dnieper, the left bank, as it were, but just Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts or provinces, in order to expand what was the pre-war Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics into the entirety of Donbass. Now, the Russians were able to do that because instead of trying to conquer a whole country, they fought more consistent with their doctrine, which is much smaller fights, much more overwhelming artillery power. And so that's a point to sort of think, how did Western sort of analysts consider how Russia would fight ahead of this war? Well, they thought, we, when sitting in Washington, National Capital Region, or elsewhere in, NATO capitals, we're thinking something like, how would Russia go after Baltics? That would be relatively concentrated areas, concentrated firepower, destroy anything that moves, then send in the troops. That's obviously people were then projecting what would Russia do if it was trying to take, Estonia onto an area that's much larger, many more people, etc. What Russia couldn't do there, Russia was able to do in Donetsk and Luhansk. So they were able to move, albeit very, very slowly. Once the Ukrainians then introduced from weapons, from the West, HIMARS and other sort of longer range weaponry, the Ukrainians were able, in effect, to arrest Russian advances. And over the past basically 2 months or month, let's say month to 6 weeks, the Ukrainians have effectively arrested Russian advances and have turned basically a static front line into a war of attrition. And what we've seen over the past couple of weeks, and I think we'll get to it in just a little bit, is that the Ukrainians have been able to evolve their fighting capabilities from very close fights, the javelin at the beginning of the conflict, to further and further fights. And I'll ask you in a second, how have you evaluated what Ukraine's been able to do in the last 6 months? And part of that is reaching out and touching the Russians at much further distances, which leads us now, in effect, to potentially the third phase of this conflict, which is the Ukrainian counteroffensive starting in its south. And from that, we'll get to in a second. So with these three phases, shock and awe, which failed, the Donbass strategy, which was arrested, and now we're going into whether Ukraine has the initiative to reverse those advances. Two questions that we've talked about at the very beginning of this conflict, all the way for the last 6 months, is what's going to happen first? Is Western military support going to continue, basically indefinitely? Or is the Russian economy going to hold out basically indefinitely? And so on the first question, just today, a release from the White House, and I'll basically read a summarized version of it. The White House released a press release saying that they're, congratulating Ukraine on its independence, saying that they continue to support the people of Ukraine as they, quote, continue the fight to defend their sovereignty. And President Biden then goes on to say that he's proud to, quote, announce the biggest tranche of security assistance to date, approximately 2.98 billion of weapons and equipment to be provided through the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. This will allow Ukraine to acquire air defense systems, artillery systems and munitions, counter unmanned aerial systems, so counter drone, and radars to ensure it can continue to defend itself over the long term. Now, in a moment, I'll move into thinking about what were Russia's pre-war strategic, military and political objectives. But I want to just pause here and ask you, really, in effect, how have you observed Ukraine's ability to fight on day one of this conflict? And now that we're at day 180, what have you seen Ukraine been able to do, been able to learn? And additionally, what have you observed on the Russian side, what they've been able to do, what they've been able to learn? One of the things that, we've talked about over the previous 6 months is the thing that successful militaries are able to do in conflict is to be able to learn while fighting. Not only do you need to have all your stuff in place, your logistics, so that you're able to do what you want, that you're able to, exhibit resilience under the attentions of the adversary. But what can you learn about what's working, what's not working on your own side and the other side. So how you observe that in this conflict over the last 6 months?
Yeah. So, when we said earlier you're gonna ask me that question, I was doing some rapid formulation of how to sort of characterize it in a simple fashion, and I'll do the same caveat that I've done before on past episodes, that I'm not a strategist. I'm not a high level trained operational planner. I'm admittedly, my thoughts are anecdotal, just from what I've been reading and seeing in discussions with you and other people since the war started. But kind of what I've written down here is the way Ukraine has approached this is first step was hold the line up close in the up close fight, because that was about what their capability allowed them to do. Hold the line up close. All right. Protect, blunt the offensive as much as they could. Tell the story of it. And this is where the information aspect of the, not just the military, but I mean, their sort of whole of nation approach to information, which I think is going to be a study years and years after the war is over, in not just learning sort of the different methods they've done it, but the strategy they used at the outset. And I think I mentioned this in a very early episode, is that there's sort of consensus that their information approach has been highly, highly effective. And to me, that means that they had a strategy ready to go, a deliberate information strategy on, whether or not they were going to hit the I believe button on if Russia was actually going to invade. They had prepared an information strategy in case that happened. Whether they prepared it a year ahead of time, 2 years, 2 months, I don't know. And that might be something that we get into when the war is over, and the Ukrainian government is willing to sort of share more information about it, because obviously you're not going to share some of your deepest secrets in wartime. That's not good. But the fact that they, from almost day one, they leveraged a tell the story strategy as part of their military strategy, means they had something deliberate in place, and that was part of their plan of holding the line long enough that they could tell their story, and then telling that story would let them get the stuff to push that line back, to push it back to the borders of Ukraine. And so in a very, again, anecdotal sort of sense, that's kind of how I would characterize it. And I don't know if you want to call it, if it was hope or faith, or just not really having any other option, but that sort of speaks to a strategy that they really sort of built their strategy of survival on the expectation that holding in line and telling the story would be enough to buy them time to get those things they would need 3 months, 6 months down the road, and an expectation that those things would show up, which maybe high confidence in sort of like-minded democratic governments. Maybe high confidence is better than hope or faith, because we always say in the military, like, hope is not a strategy, right? It's like you need a plan. You need a realistic plan, So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and in that, obviously, I think every person has heard, or many people have heard at some point, you can wish in one hand and crap in the other and see which one fills up first. But part of, I think this is like a really important point to dwell upon, is obviously within the larger umbrella of resilience. What is your strategy? What are the resources in place when something critical starts actually happening, so that you're implementing, not thinking about it? And part of, what I'm curious is, after the war, is when you were talking about the Ukrainian government's information strategy, was one to basically hold the line and believe that basically its Western partners would come through. Part of what we know is that for nearly a year beforehand, the United States and its allies, primarily the United States, was providing lethal aid. And so I'm curious as to whether Zelensky and his people believed that once the war started, if they could hold the line, they could then go to what is Zelensky's actual core talent. In terms of, being ready to tell the story, the guy came from an entertainment background. So he's able to effectively convey, we're under immediate danger. There's no negotiations about the future. This is our issue right now. And I think that what Zelensky identified in the West was that the key motivation that would actually get people to do stuff was shame. The shame of leaving basically Ukraine alone and defenseless. And by activating that within the various capitals, no one wants to be the first person to say, I was the first person to abandon the fight. And by getting all of them to line up effectively behind the United States in terms of support, he made everyone join one group instead of joining the probably what many Western partners wanted, which was to bring this to an end as quickly as possible. And that is basically like, I think Zelensky's true talent was identifying how to convey the message that Ukraine is willing to fight. It just needs stuff. They need ammunition, not a ride.
Yeah, and I was as you're talking, I was frantically scrolling to try and find the appropriate John Boyd quote here, because it's I don't want to overstate the case. But as you well know from our time together at the Krulak Center, maneuver warfare and John Boyd as a military theorist has been an area of personal study of mine. And there's a part of the briefings that he gave where he gets away from sort of kinetic actions on the battlefield and talks about the highest approach to conflict, not just warfare, but conflict, which a lot of Marines and other people who studied, Boyd of warfare be familiar with, like the maneuver versus the attrition style of warfare and how you conduct it sort of on that spectrum in between. But something that did not get as much attention, and my personal theory here, during Boyd's lifetime as well as after, when he wasn't around to sort of talk about it, but his highest level of conflict was actually something he called the moral style of conflict. And in that style, strategic narrative information, like literally storytelling, is a key part of that strategy, that approach. And I couldn't find the right quote, so I'm going to paraphrase, but there's one point near the very end of his presentation where he talks about how part of that strategy is articulating what he calls, quote unquote, a vision so noble. And this is where I'm going to paraphrase, but a vision so noble, basically a narrative that inspires, motivates your own people, degrades um, and corrodes the will of your adversary, but then also gets the fence sitters either onto your side or at least keeps them from supporting the other side. So what he was articulating was basically telling the story as part of your strategy to win the conflict. And again, I don't want to overstate the narrative here, but the fact that the telling the story, the information part of it, was part of the Ukrainian approach from day one. This may be the first sort of battlefield case of that vision so noble being a concrete part of strategy. The storytelling was a concrete part of the strategy, with kind of with the expectation that it would have an impact on, for lack of a better term, the conscience of the West, right? Like that vision, the story was so powerful that you could not look away. You could not say that it wasn't worth the support. And then that's where the concrete material support on the battlefield starts coming in.
And that's like a good point to just pause and think, what, like Russia's one sentence description, what is its vision here? We are going to denazify Ukraine. Ukraine's one sentence explanation: we are going to expel invaders and occupiers from our land. Which one is easier for other countries to say, yes, I believe that's true, and two, I want to get behind that?
Yeah, and that's something actually in my book on Boyd, I made a point of pointing out, and because Boyd pointed out that exact thing in comparing sort of the strategic narrative between Hitler and the Third Reich and the Western alliances, Western countries that were opposing him, right? Like what does each side have to offer, right? The Western countries, and not just the Western countries, but the allies who were fighting the Axis, they had freedom to choose your own government, freedom to pick your own destiny, freedom of the seas, free economy, like freedom, right? Freedom was literally the thing they had to offer. On the flip side, what does the Third Reich have to offer? Well, if you're not an Aryan, if you're not a German, it has nothing to offer you but slavery or extermination, right? And if you're one of those fence sitters, you may not always have the option to pick a side, right? If the Third Reich rolls in, you may not get a choice, but your buy-in after that point is pretty limited. Like, you have zero reason to support that regime, to do anything to help it achieve its goals, to do anything to help it achieve political, economic stability in the area you control. There's no reason to join it because there's nothing for you. There's literally nothing for you. Whereas, freedom has something for everybody, right? I mean, I don't want to sound like too naive, but like these things can be articulated in practice. They can be personified in some sense in practice. And like, if you're looking at the choice between Lebensraum and, hey, I'm going to be left alone and free to pick my own leaders and pick whatever economic system I want, and which one is more attractive? Which vision is more compelling, magnetic? Which vision draws you towards it? And and I think you compare those one sentences between Ukraine and Russia, and I think it's the same thing.
Yeah.
And if we want to go, I can talk about sort of the learning aspect as well, because we have talked about this before. But one of my sort of pet theories before the war started, and not limited to Russia, but from you could say that, like, the non-authoritarian approach to warfare, as well as the non-authoritarian social organization, part of being able to rapidly adapt and correct a bad situation into something more better for you, where you can survive and win, your ability, you have to have the sort of the freedom of thought to do that, and the freedom of action to do that. And the contrast between authoritarian and non-authoritarian, this does kind of go back to Boyd, but it goes back to other political theories as well. But the point is, like, under the authoritarian regimes, they do their best to eradicate that freedom of thought, that freedom to even acknowledge that something bad is happening that needs to be corrected. Because if something bad is happening, that goes right against the legitimacy and authority of the regime, because in the authoritarian regime, nothing bad ever happens. Everything is all good. We're here for the good of the people. And we've taken away lots of your different rights and your different things, but we promise you something in return, which is stability, prosperity, protection from outside malign actors, whatever you want to call it. So nothing bad can ever happen, because anything bad that does directly goes after that aura of legitimacy. And for whether it's Russia or China or North Korea, like, anybody who says, well, wait a second, that's wrong, they either get forced out of the country because you can't have that, or they accidentally fall out of windows, 4 stories, or in North Korea, you get executed by machine gun firing squad, right? The outcome might be different, but the point is that you cannot tolerate that acknowledgement of something bad, because that goes directly against the legitimacy of the regime. Now, that has lots of trickle-down effects, but what we've been seeing is that that goes all the way down into the military, where a lower military echelons can't go to the higher one and be like, hey, your plan sucks. Hey, you didn't give us enough logistics. Hey, your strategy for where the main thrust was supposed to be was way off. Hey, your intelligence assessment of the battlefield, this idea that the Ukrainians would welcome us, or at least not resist us, was way off, right? We need a different assessment. We need a different plan, a different strategy. But you can't say or do that, because the mental ability to even raise those questions has been quashed and hammered and eradicated as much as it can, because any question in any of those realms goes against the legitimacy of the regime. And where this comes into the learning organization, the ability of a military to adapt to a bad situation, is they literally have no mental habit pattern of doing that, the honest self-assessment that would allow you to correct a bad course. That habit pattern has been squashed and or eradicated for years and years, arguably as long as Putin has been in power, it has been eradicated. People literally do not have it either doesn't occur, or if it occurs in sort of a sense of doublethink, as soon as the thought occurs, it's pushed back down internally, right, because they know the consequences of raising those criticisms. That means you have created a military that cannot adapt, because it has no habit pattern. It literally cannot articulate that thought of adaptation. And so I've talked about this in other forums, as well as I think past episodes, but even if Putin flipped the switch today, right, and said, hey, from corporals to generals, I want to hear your feedback about what I've screwed up and what we can do better here, to get this thing moving again. Even if he flipped that on a switch, even if he were sincere about that, everyone below him literally does not have the cognitive habit pattern to do that. They don't know how to do that because they have been so pushed in the opposite direction. And that has built a culture of non-learning, of non-adaptation. It's built a culture of non-thinking, of just obedience, acceptance to the status quo, knowing that any disobedience or anything that even smells of not towing the party line means you get, you fall out a 4-story window or your car blows up, which we'll talk about here in a second as well.
Yeah.
Conversely, looking at, non-authoritarian cultures, of which, military culture is downstream of your larger culture, right? Which is kind of my point. Your military's lack of adaptation, the authoritarian regime, is downstream of a authoritarian culture that does not tolerate questions. Adaptation requires questions and critical thought about how to answer those questions. Authoritarian regimes don't like questions. So your military leader's not going to articulate that either. Whereas on the non-authoritarian side, even on a bad day, as long as your larger culture allows questions to be asked and, has opportunities where questions, critical thought about answering the questions, and then looking at a different outcome from what's not working, as long as that exists in some way, your military is going to be downstream of that. So your military is going to be able to ask questions about what went wrong, adapt, and look at doing something better. And I think that is what we've been seeing between the Russian military and the Ukrainian military as a learning organization. And I think as you've gone through these phases of the war, it's been interesting because the Ukrainians keep getting the tranches of support. They've gone from we're fighting at javelin distance now to we're fighting at HIMARS or longer, right? And again, I don't want to overstate, but we've seen in other American efforts to support other militaries over the last 20 years, just because you give them the stuff doesn't mean they're going to know how to use it or employ it most effectively. So just because, we poured in billions of dollars worth of military aid to Ukraine, pretty much from the get-go, there was no guarantee, like if their military culture downstream of their larger culture was not an adaptable, a thinking, questioning, and looking for answer type culture, all the HIMARS in the world, all the javelins in the world are not going to help you because you don't have the mental habit patterns to look at something new, look at a problem, look for a solution to that problem, and plug into something new to fix it. I think we have seen in the 6 months that the Ukrainian culture and military culture downstream, they have that questioning, that adaptability, that a free, relatively free and open society lets you have, right? And we've seen the Russians, like everybody keeps waiting for the Russians to learn and adapt, but here we are 6 months later, and they're still putting, ammunition in large static depots. They're still not defending it, and it still gets blown up. Like, if there were any aspect of learning in the Russian military culture, it should have manifested by now. And Jayla's personal opinion here, we have not seen that. And I literally don't think they can, because Putin has shaped the culture so much in the opposite. Deliberately. He this is the military culture he wanted. This is how it performs on the battlefield.
And I'd say to that Putin has been in power for more than 20 years because he recognized what was the Russian political culture. And a country's political culture then effectively shapes the military culture. Because when you describe the differences between one side, and being open cognitively means that not only do you identify failures for what they are and try to learn why did failures happen, but also where does success come from? Identifying things that can happen, go well, identify high risk, high reward, operations, do them. If they go well, say like, okay, we're starting to learn good, bad. And on the other side, Mao, like in China, like had a certain period in which he said, where he was obviously China, also authoritarian political culture. And he had this, what he called Let 100 Flowers Bloom, the 100 Flowers campaign, in which he wanted people to have alternative views on his rule and like what could be done better. And once those critics started to emerge and, give their criticisms, those were the people that were basically purged first once Mao brought the 100 Flowers campaign to an end. And so in terms of the authoritarian political culture leading to the military culture, we've talked for 6 months about, one of the differences about Ukraine, Russia is that Ukraine's adopting, not from its Soviet past, but from basically working with NATO, basically having this non-commissioned officer system. And the non-commissioned officers of people on the ground who are empowered to make decisions. If something's going poorly, stop. If something's going well, continue. We've seen numerous videos that on the Russians, when they're getting attacked, when they're getting ambushed, no one's taking charge. And so part of that is for someone to take charge at the lowest level. For someone at the lowest level, not in an actual firefight, concentrated burst of violence, but for someone to question an authority, an order, means that the person above them is wrong. And if the person above them is wrong and they got it direct from their superior, that means the next person is wrong. And in a vertical political culture, it means that a private, a corporal, the lowest person saying, I think we can do this better, eventually means that Putin is wrong. And for Putin to be wrong calls into question the entire system, which is why nobody does it. So even people who probably do know better are faced with that choice. You said either they don't think, and we can talk about the human condition, whether people know things are wrong or not. But certainly people have, in 2022, bad news is coming from the front. They're faced with a choice. Am I the person who gives bad news, or am I the person who says things are great? Because if I say things are great, it's someone else's problem to deal with. If I say it's bad news, I now own that message. And there are very few people who are willing to put themselves ahead of just getting by. And that at its core is why, when we're seeing all these like entire airfields and air bases and ammunition depots, which are getting blown up due to smoking and hot weather, that quite literally someone is responsible for explaining why places inside Russia, places on Crimea, are no longer items of military value, that they come up with a story that says it's just deep incompetence, that one soldier smoking or unpredictable that Belgorod is hot in August, that those are the best available explanations, other than we know the Ukrainians are coming, they keep destroying these things, and we can't tell our superiors that they keep destroying it, so we just tell them it's a safety issue.
Yeah, and that's, I do want to transition to those most recent explosions, but I think, whatever else happens in the course of the conflict here in the coming months, again, JLo's personal opinion here, but I think asking whether or not the Russian military is capable of, is a learning organization is a moot question at this point, because it has literally been crafted under Russian culture, as a reflection of it, crafted to not be learning, to not be questioning. And you cannot undo that in a few months. You can go to war with maybe some bad peacetime leaders and get punched in the face a few times, which, looking back at American, British militaries and in the world wars, you can suck in the initial days of the war, but if your larger social dynamic is one that does allow for questioning, identifying problems, and correcting, you can recover from that. I don't think the Russian culture that has deliberately been crafted, and of which the military is a reflection, they've been crafted 180 degrees out from being able to do that. I don't think we will see any learning. We're going to see just more, I think, just more throwing bodies and older equipment at the problem, because that is the only option that they have, that they've been given, that they're allowed to do.
Some months ago, I was giving a talk, and someone in the audience was trying to describe like the Russian way of war. And he was trying to find some polite way to assess it. And, after sort of staring into deep space for a couple of moments, he said, the Russians seem to prefer a casualty intensive way of war. And like that sort of encapsulates, I think, what you're saying is that the Russians don't learn because they're willing to put as many people into the meat grinder as necessary. And I think when we then transition into thinking about Russia's political objectives, as a military organization, we've seen how they're not learning. As a political culture and as political leadership, I thought, before we started recording, I wanted to go over what were the pre-war Russian political demands, going back to Sergei Lavrov giving demands, the Russian foreign minister, to the United States, NATO, in November, which really sort of signified that this was an imminent conflict. So the Russians said various things here, but stop NATO expansion to new countries altogether, stop NATO's deepening involvement in all countries that joined after 1997, so all the post-communist countries. And they said at the time that not only is NATO not allowed to ever have new members, but that NATO must remove all of its military infrastructure, meaning both troops and equipment, from all countries that joined, after Germany, as it were, when Germany reunited. They wanted to stop Ukraine as what they called an anti-Russia, which means Ukraine as a pro-West or a country trying to join European or transatlantic institutions. That had to come to an end. They wanted to support Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics directly. And this was the language about the denazification, which is basically how the Russians were trying to euphemize a regime change. They wanted to certify or sort of identify Russia as a pole of the international system, meaning they wanted to gain Ukraine as a client state. They wanted to gain Chinese support. They wanted to gain partners everywhere else by demonstrating how effectively they could project influence onto basically Central Europe. And they wanted to consolidate their hold on Crimea, Donbass, and basically make Ukraine as small as possible. So what have we seen now that it's gone 6 months? Sweden and Finland, which had been, Sweden had been neutral country for the last 200 plus years, is now on its way to becoming a NATO member. Finland, which had quite literally lent itself to the phrase Finlandization of how you choose neutrality in order to avoid angering your larger, angrier, more aggressive neighbor, also on its way to join NATO. And both the Finns and the Swedes have articulated that, if Russia was willing to do this to a country that it quote unquote liked because it felt proximity, what would they do to another former colony, i.e. Finland? Was the relationship of Finland to NATO and other countries sufficient without an Article 5 nuclear deterrent capability in place? And the Finns made that decision that, simply put, what Russia did in Ukraine meant that Finland was not safe. And if Finland's not safe, then Sweden's not safe. So NATO looks to be expanding to 2 more countries because of this war. NATO has additionally added 4 battle groups in Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria to join the ones that were in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. The US Army is going to put a permanent structure in Poland as basically its regional headquarters. So, and all countries in the region, because one, they've given a lot of their Soviet era immediately usable equipment to Ukraine, is backfilling that from the United States. So in effect, all of these countries are modernizing their military equipment, as Ukraine is also doing as well. So defense spending across all of NATO is going up. Ukraine is an anti-Russia. Ukraine basically has redefined what it means to articulate one's own sovereignty and autonomy under conditions of wartime. And the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, we can look at basically the relationship between the Baltic countries and Russia and to say there is no healthy relationship between these countries. They only deal with each other through the language of basically conflict and diplomacy, but the cultural bonds have been broken. And we can imagine that over the next 100 years, Ukraine and Russia, when we think about Ukrainians and Russian language, Russian culture, the connection to Russia, Russia is always going to be much bigger than Ukraine. Ukrainian language and Russian language, like they're not the same, but they are fairly close. They're in this, relatively speaking, the same language group. People, I believe, people over the next 25, 50, 100 years in Russia, in Ukraine, will look at Russia not as a Russian, not as a language that they ought to learn because of cultural connections, but purely in a functional business sense. Russia is a country of 140 million plus. Similar enough, learn it because it's useful for business. It's useful for, whatever other sort of interactions, but that there's no emotional reason to learn this language anymore. And that we can imagine in Ukraine, probably English and, other major European languages are going to be the ones that Ukrainians think of the languages they should learn. And Russian is just going to join English as just a foreign language that is useful and functional, but no deep substantive emotional meaning. Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, once this war is over, between the fighting over the previous 8 years, because this war started in 2014, whatever has happened over the past 6 months, whatever is going to happen over the next 18 to 24, these are going to be deindustrialized, depopulated areas. There's nothing useful that's going to be happening in DNR or LNR for a long time. That's going to be another result of when the Ukrainians think about their territory. If the Russians aren't paying for it, they're probably going to leave that as basically a demilitarized zone. And then thinking about Russia as a pole of the international system, in 6 months, the Russians have been unable to get Belarus to actually join the fighting. They supported Kazakhstan, like the President Tokayev. He faced like a coup attempt in January. They could not get him to join their war in February. They have had to pull troops from the Kuril Islands, from peacekeeping duties in Nagorno-Karabakh, from Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and from basically anti-Taliban guard duty in Tajikistan in order to join this fighting. They have had to openly acknowledge the heavy usage of the Wagner private military group. So if you are in the region and you are, let's say, in sub-Saharan Africa, so you see Russia over troops, across its borders, you see Russia, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, through its private military companies, what are you thinking is the lasting power of this military, of its auxiliaries and its proxies, and particularly once you've seen what Russian military equipment can do over the last 6 months, what do you think is the value of that S-300 system that you've been saving up to buy, or that S-400 that if you just hold out a bit longer, you might go for? We've already seen that Philippines just last week canceled a helicopter order. Because if you're going to buy something, why do you buy something that you know will not be able to withstand the equivalent US military or other NATO military equipment? And then when thinking about the consolidation of Crimea and, making Ukraine as small as possible, once, as you often say, Ukraine was able to reach out and touch areas that the Russians thought was Russia, which is how they considered Ukraine. They've been able to hit air bases outside Yevtoporia, the Saki Air Base, which in the last episode I had noted, that was the air base where Roosevelt and Churchill landed when they were doing the Yalta peace talks, or post World War II talks. But if the Ukrainians are also able to hit the Black Sea Fleet headquarters, and they directly threaten the Kerch Bridge, we've seen that the Russian tourists, settlers, colonists, however you describe them, the Russian civilians in Crimea have identified that whatever the special military operation language is on TV is not consistent with the fact that the Ukrainians seem pretty intent on removing them by force. And we've seen tens of thousands of Russians leave over the last 2 weeks. They don't want to test which one is more correct: Ukrainian long-range missile attacks, or what they hear on Russian TV talk shows. It's because it's a clear choice. Do you believe what the Russian media is telling you, or do you believe the missiles which just narrowly missed you? The choice is yours at that point. And so when we think about what is Russia in terms of its pre-war strategic objectives and political objectives, learning, what is Russia going to do over the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months? Is it going to be able to learn and change its objectives, or is it just going to throw more bodies into the meat grinder? I think we have an idea of what it's going to do, but again, is that one of the most popular Russian TV talk shows is called "Время покажет," time will tell.
Yeah, although I'm pretty sure I know where I would put my money on picking
Yeah.
picking one or two. So I know we're coming up on the end of the time we had allotted here. I want to make sure we do get to the sort of the big event over the weekend. But just other things, for people to consider that we've been tracking that we did touch on past episodes is, and we talked about the attack on Saki Air Base, and there, as you said, the Sevastopol Naval Headquarters. There's been more going on in Crimea, and I've been watching these various ammunition dumps and air bases and command and control buildings get hit, and I'm still not sure which sort of theory about the mode of attack Ukraine has been using. And I've seen people who've been commenting and been saying maybe they have the missile that shall not be named given to them as military aid and nobody's saying it, or maybe maybe it is SOF, or maybe it's partisans, or maybe it's a combination of SOF and partisans and UASs. Still, or maybe it's a combination of all of them and some airstrikes thrown in to boot. Although we still haven't seen any sort of video evidence of Ukrainian Air Force going into Crimea and doing this. But like we talked about in the last episode, they're flying low enough and undetected enough. It's not impossible. But anyway, we've been seeing more of the same in the last few weeks as well. The bridge we've also been talking about, the Antonivsky Bridge going across into Kherson, looks like for military use, it's been rendered neuter, or it's been neutralized. There are still bridge spans, but being able to pass traffic and logistics over it, no longer a factor. So we're talking about the third phase of the counteroffensive. I think we've been seeing more signs that it's under preparation, and I think maybe on the next episode we could talk more about what are some of the drivers at play here, because some of the commentators I've been reading been like, there's definitely for weather reasons, for political support reasons, both domestically and internationally, getting into a counteroffensive going sooner rather than later. There's a lot of impetus to why you should do that. Is the Ukrainian military ready to do that? It may not be, but so are they going to be moved forward anyway for non-military considerations? Time will tell, right? But something certainly to watch in the coming weeks, because the activity going on in Crimea and near Kherson and the southern part of the Dnieper River smacks of prepping the battle space, getting ready for something larger scale to happen. Anyway, I don't want to dwell on that because we are kind of limited on time, but just something to watch in the coming weeks. And maybe we'll start to see more signs of it, where the counteroffensive, if it's coming in the coming weeks, where it's emerging. Last point we did want to get to, though, was aside from things blowing up in Crimea and across the Russian border in places like Belgorod, there was a very high level, very visible attack in Moscow over the weekend, where Darya Durgina, daughter of Aleksandr Dugin, spectacular is not the right word, but in very visible fashion, was blown up in a car bomb. And there was, video circulating around of her father, head in hands, looking at the burning car that his daughter was just in. And this has raised a lot of questions. Well, a lot of questions. One, like, this is in the heart of Russia. This is in Moscow. Like, this is not something where, flinging a missile across the border to hit an ammunition depot. This is in the heart of Moscow, the heart of Putin's power. But if you could take maybe 5 minutes and walk us through, who were these people? Why might they have one or the other been targeted? Who was the actual target? Who the Russians say carried this out or alleged carried it out? Your thoughts on who may actually have carried it out and what message it was trying to send. And this is a tangled web of getting into some, really weird Russian conspiracy stuff. But I'm confident you can walk us through it here in the next few minutes.
So I'm really glad that we're talking about conspiracy theories because I was trying to first think, for those who don't know the name Aleksandr Dugin, um, like what's maybe an American equivalent that might be of use. And the best that I could think of, and again, talking about conspiracy theories, is if you had someone like Glenn Beck, but like more openly fascist and imperialist. Like that's basically where we are. So Dugin is like his own PR has often put out that he's Putin's brain. At a moment in time, he had like an idea, and I want to place his idea in context because that sets up basically the range of theories on why his daughter was killed or why he may have been the target. So many times in Russian history, the country is like collapsed or has no idea like what to do. Um, so for those who maybe study, international relations, there's an old theorist from the 19th century into the 20th named Alfred Mackinder. And Mackinder's big idea, again, if you've read 1984 by George Orwell, these ideas get introduced. But the idea that the world is made up of very few areas, and that the one in the middle that basically encompasses from Europe all the way to Asia, crossing Russia, is the world island. And whoever controls the world island controls the world, because then they have access to the world oceans. So Eurasianism is basically the Russian interpretation of this. And Eurasianism is something that Dugin has basically been the leading modern proponent of. But after the Russian Revolution, after the death of Stalin, this has come up in Russian history. And there's a great book by Charles Clover called Black Wind, White Snow that goes over this in detail. But basically, whenever Russia's in really bad shape, after revolution, after the death of Stalin, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when it's unclear basically what is the next big national idea, this idea of the world island and Eurasianism, which is Russia basically fulfilling its imperial mission to control everything around it, taking into account its Viking heritage, its Mongol heritage, that it is simply better than the decadent West and effete East, that this is Russia's role, that what Russia should do is basically imperialism. So obviously, those are ideas that gain most attraction or most currency when Russia's in a bad place, because it then says we're in a bad place temporarily. If we just go back to basics of imperialism, then we will go boldly into the future. So Dugin has been a proponent of this since like the 1980s. And for a brief period of time, when Russia was basically figuring out under Putin, what is the mechanism by which we will expand our influence and power abroad, these ideas basically had their moment. Dugin's consistent, but they're briefly popular at the highest levels. But Dugin himself doesn't have a big position in Russian intellectual society, doesn't have a teaching job, he doesn't have like a TV show. He's just a guy who's extremely online. So that's where he is. So that's what I was thinking, maybe Glenn Beck, but like without like production values, something like that. So his daughter, Darya Durgina, was killed in a car bomb. And just one quick correction, not in the heart of Moscow, but even better, in the heart of the super posh area right outside Moscow, where the actual like rich people, high government people, oligarchs, where they actually live. So this is the equivalent of, the someone on Fifth Avenue getting blown up, or someone, near like in Beverly Hills, like on Rodeo Drive, like getting blown up. Something that is the actual where actual rich people live. So there have been several ideas floated out there. The official story is from the FSB is that they identified the person who is an Azov regiment fighter who came into Russia in a car, a Mini Cooper, thus bringing in the British, with her daughter, 12-year-old daughter, and a cat. And again, if I've said something over the last number of years of us talking, Russians are cat people. So the cat is important because it says this person understood, the way to appear non-threatening was to bring a child and a cat. So entered Russia on DNR license plates, rented an apartment in that area, and was basically driving around, basically preparing for the mission for the past 3 months on Kazakh plates, and then after doing a car bombing, then drove to Estonia for 10 hours and entered Estonia that way. So basically, again, the official FSB story is that their deep incompetence is what allowed this person to die. And then, so that's basically that's the official story. Unofficial story, and so Azov's response to this is, since many of their fighters were captured as POWs, this is the story that's going to connect them to a murder of a Russian in Russia. And that is going to be the justification of preparing Russian public opinion for show trials and execution of Ukrainian POWs. There was an internet group called the National Republican Army, NRA, which then basically took responsibility. And here's actually what I think is an interesting theory, because it basically says in their letter, that they criticize Putin for being corrupt, that he's not fighting the war effectively, and basically attacking Putin from a right-wing perspective. And by attacking Putin from a right-wing perspective, this is what opens up, in terms of Russian domestic politics, the ability to root out all the people connected to Dugin or to the far right, to all of these nationalists who may support Putin, sure, but are more interested in defeating Ukraine, and that they don't want Putin to mess up what should be Russia's victory over Ukraine and thus the West. And this might be, in essence, the cause for a purge of basically the Russian nationalist right. That's an option. Could also be intra-fascist dispute, money and influence from the Kremlin, sending a message to Dugin to cool his jets, and potentially support for mobilization writ large. And again, on that one, that seems a bit unlikely, because why would they need to kill a person that almost no one in the country has heard of in order to create a symbol? They'll do their best. So long story short, we'll see what happens. Time will tell.
Yes, time will tell. And I mean, unfortunate things happening to people who are not totally in line with the regime in Russia. Certainly nothing new. And, very rarely do we ever get to the most likely, probable thing that actually happened. But it was just, this was not somebody falling out a 4-story window accidentally on purpose. This was, very visible, as you said, in the heart of sort of the most privileged part, and which indicates it wanted to send a message. But what that message is and what the impact is I guess still up in the air.
The only reasonable way that Ukraine did this is basically by doing a car bombing in a really posh area, that they sufficiently scare all the people who live in that area, thus diverting FSB resources and police resources and political resources at the time that the Ukrainians are starting up their counteroffensive. So that this is, Dugina just happened to be the person who is sufficiently important to get noticed, but sufficiently unimportant to not actually make any sort of difference, just at the time that the Ukrainians are about to do something. That's the only reasonable Ukraine actually did it theory.
Yeah, although I think on the probability list, we can put that as close to mathematically zero as possible, because knocking out political opponents is something that Putin is quite good at.
Yeah,
not really something we've seen in sort of since the Maidan in Ukraine. But yeah, time will tell.
We'll see if the purges happen, and then we'll see who is the real target here. Indeed.
All right, so we've been going about an hour, and do have to jet here, but I think we wanted to. It was important to mark the where we're 6 months into this, and this again, it's a special day. It's for Ukrainians, a special day, celebrating their independence while they're literally fighting for independence. That's sort of not something a lot of countries have to think about on their own Independence Day in the 21st century, but they certainly are. And now 6 months to the day since the war started as well. And as you said, never thought we would go this long. And I'm really hoping that we don't have a 1 year mark where we're still revisiting and talking about this. But again, time will tell. But I think, as you've mentioned in past episodes too, the next few months are going to be key into what the long-term shape of this conflict is going to be. All right. Well, Yuval, as always, great to see you. Thanks for your insights. Take care. And for all of our listeners out there, thanks for sticking with us. And we'll have another episode of The Rabbit Hole out to you here shortly in the next week or so.
Thank you, and happy trails.
You too.